I will quickly pass this on to Leslie Ann and team to talk about what is Mojaloop, a discussion panel about how we should talk about Mojaloop and helping outsiders understand better what Mojaloop is. So Leslie Ann, when you're ready, I will pass it over to you and you can introduce the rest of the team.
I'm here and I'm ready, Simeon. I'm hoping that Paul and Steve are also feeling like turning the cameras on today.
There
we go. Awesome, awesome. Okay, so this session, it's a fireside chat with a few of us from the community. I joined Mojaloop just before the last convening, and I've been involved in lots of discussions the last quarter with potential adopters and with community members who are actively reaching out to those who may consider Mojaloop as a solution. We've also got the newly formed product council that Paula mentioned, and we've been talking a lot with that community about what's needed to help Mojaloop gain the kind of traction that we want to see. And it has shown up a few myths around what Mojaloop is, what it isn't, and that's what I want to kind of dig into over the next half hour or so. So, Steve and Paul, I actually know you guys evolved. You've been kicking around in the financial inclusion space for a long time. I wanted to give you a chance, both of you, to briefly set the scene for what brought you to Mojaloop community. Steve or Paul? Paul, why don't you go?
Steve, go first. Go on.
All right, fine. So just to not waste time. So yeah, my background was I was working for a nonprofit, an INGO, for a long time, and we were always talking about this idea of we were working with MFIs, and we were always talking, how can we connect MFIs to this new innovation that is mobile money? And that conversation is still ongoing in that sector. I left it quite a bit long time ago to join the mobile money sector and see if I could do it from the mobile money side. And I found, no, actually, there are some, even working for a market leading mobile money company, there are significant obstacles to try to transact with other financial institutions, obstacles that are technical, obstacles that are business, obstacles that are mindset. And so I left that to focus on interoperability in Myanmar, where I was working on, and particularly with a mind towards the microfinance sector, which I've always thought has a massive opportunity to serve the last mile with robust products and services. And so that's, anyone who's ever heard me talk knows that I'm pretty much focused on that all the time. So yeah, that's what got me here. And actually, right when I left my job to try to figure out the solution is when Mojaloop was announced, and so it was very timely for me.
Fantastic. Paul, what about you?
Early in the mists of recorded time, I used to work in the conventional payment sector, working with Visa and MasterCard on developing new payment products and working with banks to implement them. But I kind of got more than a little bored of that and started working in some of the early cryptocurrencies, stuff like DigiCash and so on, thinking, how can we move money around really cheaply? And then got into working with mobile phones and thinking, what can we do with that? And that led me to ultimately a service that we were designing in East Africa with mobile phones, which came to be called M-Pesa.
That's where you and I met.
Which is where you and I met, because I wrote the RFP that you responded to. So it's going back a few years now.
2005 for
2004,
me.
I started with it, yeah. So I then left M-Pesa and started working on, we developed an offline extension to M-Pesa, worked around other mobile financial services, and developed digital identity solutions in Nigeria and Somalia, and eventually came to the realization that although financial inclusion was what was driving me, what we were doing was creating lots of little islands of financial inclusion. And that is clearly not satisfactory in any sense. And that's what attracted me to the idea of Mojaloop. Because actually, way back, before Mojaloop actually came to life, I and a few others actually bid to be the modus box of this space, but we didn't win it. So there you go. Mojaloop to me is really important because it allows us to interconnect those islands. And consequently, now that's why I'm working with Modusbox on how do we bring everyone together and how do we achieve the real destination of financial inclusion.
Awesome. So we've all been kicking around in financial inclusion for a long time. And so we've all, I think, joined this because we're excited about the potential of what pain points that Mojaloop can solve. And I wanted to dig in a little bit about that, the pain that we focus on solving here at Mojaloop. Do you want to kick us off, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about Mojaloop in a sort of fairly esoteric level of we can interconnect banks and connect them to MFIs and so on, and that's really important. But what drives me in that space is not the MFIs. I mean, they're nice guys, but they're not the end purpose for me. It's the fact that we're connecting the MFI's customers. So suddenly they're actually able to participate in the mainstream financial sector. So they can access all of the services that the prosperous customers of the biggest bank in the country can also access in an appropriate manner, of course. But suddenly the rails are there to allow us to interconnect. And that actually has potentially radical implications. If we follow the train of thought down from where we are now to, say, even 5 years in the future, the stuff that we can be doing on these basic rails we're trying to put in at the moment, which could really work to drive economic development in many countries. And to me, the whole purpose of financial inclusion is to make individuals at the bottom of the pyramid more prosperous through the overall economic development of the country, not to leave the money at the top.
And I think that's key to realise that financial exclusion isn't only those in the social protection programs that need GTP payments, and even more so in COVID times, but it's also those small traders who need to be part of a burgeoning financial ecosystem, a supply chain where it just works from customer through to trader, through to factories, through to delivery drivers.
You're touching on exactly the message I'm trying to get across, which is that people are not individual use cases. They live in an ecosystem, and we have to fully submerge ourselves in that ecosystem if we're going to actually make a success of this. Focusing on one or two use cases is not the reality of people, because then you give them a reason, a need to resort back to cash and therefore back into little disconnected islands.
And the way I often tell that story is also through the innovator ecosystem. So it's not the same in an African context than it was in 2005.
No.
Now we have all kinds of interesting businesses innovating around the Kidogo economy. Like small payments are really important. So I worked for a little while for Mkopa Solar, and we suffered from all these pain points of money movement. Our goal in life was to turn the lights on when customers made a payment via mobile money rails. But if the mobile money company wasn't able to tell us reliably, yes, your payment has been made, and settle that into our bank account, we then had a whole plethora of business processes to make sure that the right amount of money arrived at the right time, and then making sure that the customer's lights actually turned on. Because if the APIs were not robust, it meant that we could receive payment from the customer. Customer got really unhappy because we didn't turn their lights on because we used IoT. And so it's that moment of how do we make it really a robust system end to end from the customer perspective through to his light switch. There are so many actors and players in that story. That was the reality of being an innovator in this ecosystem. You need these rails to be the best they could possibly be for you.
Yeah, and I remember talking to the operator of a small chain of corner shops in Kenya, talking about why they liked M-Pesa. And that's because they accepted card payments, but card payments took a long time, and the money would come along in, 2, 3, 4, 5 days' time. Whereas if they integrated with M-Pesa, suddenly the money's coming in straight away. And this was just vastly improving their business. They could, the liquidity increase was 12, 15 times. So the use of money was so much better as a fundamental economic driving force. So they could constantly turn over the stock on the shelves, which meant they had happier customers, which meant that they were more profitable, they were employing more people, and they were uplifting their local community. And that's the difference that an instant payment can make. It's not just about feeling good.
That's the difference from cards to instant payments. But from cash to instant payments, there are still plenty of barriers, and actually cash is king.
It is.
And we've got a lot of work still to do in the financial inclusion ecosystem to move away from cash as king. And
We
that
have,
fundamentally,
because cash is the ultimate interoperable payment system.
And there's plenty of research out there that says a customer, they require trust in the ecosystem for it to work. And you start to do things that aren't if you start to create ecosystems that are clunky and hard to interact with and multiple different user experiences, and maybe sometimes they work and sometimes they're not available, you start to go to the customer. Do you know what? Customer goes, cash is best.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've seen that in India. And Steve, you've had experience in this recently, that some of the barriers that were put in place, which meant that people were resorting to cash, but with a little bit of flexibility, it's changed. So perhaps you'd like to come in on that.
Sure, but I mean, first though, I want to say that it's really interesting to listen to you guys where, on the one hand, Paul saying this is a great thing that we learned, that people said this was great about mobile money, which was this great thing about instantaneous. Whereas Leslie Ann's actually talking about a problem she had working for a pay-go solar company that mobile money was not answering. And I think to me, you say the original question is what gets us excited about Mojaloop? What gets me excited about Mojaloop is the lack of lock-in to any particular Rails or vendor. And that's because, hard to keep my language in check, that's because the companies that are providing that service to those pay-go solar don't care, because they don't have to care, because they own the market. And it's the same thing that we see. Oh, come on. No, because why would they? No, actually, it's not bad. That's their business. Their business is they're going to drive where the transactions are going to drive their business. And if pay-go solar is not something that is driving their business, then they're not going to focus on that use case, and they're not going to focus on that part of the ecosystem. And that's right for them to do. Yeah. But that's why we have to make sure that the Rails are not owned by one particular company. The Rails are a utility that allows anybody to compete on. And
so I'm going to counter with that. A little bit. I think every new use case that comes along starts small, but it starts to get traction, and then the creakiness and the holes start to come out, and we all improve as a consequence. So actually, reliability of mobile money rails in 2020 for solar financing is awesome in Kenya compared to what it was in 2012 when I was working on it. And that's because the volumes are there now and it is making sense. And so there's lots of lessons to be learned for the blueprints.
For sure, but once there's volumes there, then they can care. But it's not a dig on them. That's where a lot of you have talked about where you wanted to take that mobile money use cases and product sets in the very beginning and where it ended up going instead. And that's totally fine. The businesses are going to take it that way in the same way as the card businesses have taken the cards in the way that they wanted to go. But the market wants something else. And if we allow for centralization of control over Rails among a few small companies, then we're not going to get that kind of innovation that smaller players might need. And I think that's where I get excited about Mojaloop is if we can keep those Rails as a public utility, then that type of innovation on the edges can happen and can happen effectively, and then come in to the center. But at least it can work. You're not relying on begging three companies.
You're actually making a technical point there, though. It's not just commercial point. The Rails have to be as cheap, as efficient, as reliable as we can, and there has to be equal access to all service providers, as you suggest, etc. And that's what one of the key parts of Mojaloop is. Mojaloop allows us to do those centralized, efficient, cheap Rails, which do one job really well in moving money from A to B. Everything else is a layer above.
So it's worth interjecting then, because actually that's leading me nicely to the next point I make in our preparation for this was actually our place in the ecosystem as Mojaloop is to serve DFSPs and hub operators with our blueprints and our open source digital asset and our community and our movement. But actually the way that we Mojaloop make financial inclusion impact is through using the fact that we've learned all these lessons over the years and creating effective blueprints and helping those who want to make this better, because we're not running a switch.
No, absolutely. But we have to make sure that we are building those Rails in the manner which makes sure that a large corporate bank doesn't get to dominate. and drive out the smaller players. The point is equal access. And that,
or
Which is one
corporate
of our
technology
principles.
company, not just corporate bank.
not just, corporate technology company as well. Yeah, quite. But I want that smallest MFI, and more particularly their customers, to be able to access the rails on an equal basis.
Yeah. Agree. And the local fintech to be able to compete with the likes of Google and WhatsApp.
Yeah.
So I was thinking through the lens of the customer again, and I was thinking about what truly do we bring in terms of financial inclusion impact. And I think it is the fact that even little things like in our designs, it's the improved user experience that when it's designed thoughtfully that we bring to the story. It can be quite complicated for a customer right now to go through multiple hops, and sometimes the SMS that comes to the customer has these brands in it that it doesn't recognize, the aggregator brands, because the money lands somewhere else. And it's the moment of actually, if you had the ability to step back and go, what would we really design based on what we know now, and what might we do differently? And I think that's core of what we're bringing with these blueprints, is some kind of very, very thoughtful design with the financial inclusion customer in mind.
Yep. Sorry, I can't really disagree with you there, Alyssa. Completely agree.
Awesome. So we've been talking a lot this last quarter to various people who might choose to run a level 1 principles Mojaloop enabled, Mojaloop powered new hub. And we've been looking at it through the lens also, well, how do we change our messaging? How do we need to upgrade how we talk about Mojaloop as part of learning what was going on? Yeah. What are some of the key things, some of the key myths that you think we should be dispelling? Steve,
I mean, one of the first ones is that Mojaloop is a payment company, that really making it clear that it is there. Like you said at the beginning, our job is to serve hub operators and DFSPs. And I think that's one of the main things that we really need to be focusing on, that is who we serve, not compete with hub operators, because that's been something that has been coming up over and over again, where if the people you're serving are worried you're trying to compete with them, you kind of get blocked. And so I think that's one of the big myths I'd love for us to really, really be strongly talking about.
It connects non-bank and bank participants, not end users. It's really not a platform for the actual customer. It's those who serve it, B2B2C.
Yep. Absolutely.
That's precisely right. But that is a little bit of an issue for us, because we constantly come up against potential users, potential hub operators who focus very much on the end user case. So can you do QR payments? Can you do contactless card payments? Can you do this type of payment? That kind of, yes, we move money from A to B. The front bit is up to somebody else. I mean, we have some opinions about it, and some very good ideas in my view, but we are not the people who will actually provide you with that QR code reader, for example. So,
however, we could look to a future where we have a marketplace of those who do.
Yeah. Oh God,
and we can showcase those who do.
Yes.
And that's our vision, actually. How do we be a place where we find marketplace compatible solutions and start to help that ecosystem thrive?
And also, this community has a lot of people in it who have done this kind of thing lots of times before. We can provide you with the guidance on what the steps you need to do it and what the potential problems are. But that's not what Mojaloop is. This is something on the outside. I mean, I'm a fairly opinionated individual. I can give you some guidance on this, but I'm not the one to provide you with it.
I think, sorry, I don't know if you're going to go to Miller's comment first, but I think first thing I want to say is like this really idea of we're there to help hub operators reduce their cost of operating. That's, I mean, really what we're trying to do, so that then they can pass off that reduction of cost to end users. And I think just being hyper focused on that's what we're doing, because again, there are people who like understanding that there's a lot more that goes into a payment system than just the technology. There's the operations, there's the regulation, there's the policy. And there's the technical operations, the business operations, the settlement, all of those other things. And that all we are trying to do is build a technology that can allow them to reduce all of those costs as far down as possible. But we don't actually do those things. We don't actually do the business operations. And I think that's going to be, I'd really like us to make sure that the market understands that is something that good hub operators will do and will always do. And we just want to help them do it better, cheaper.
I think that's key. We provide blueprints, we provide some digital asset in terms of the software, and we help operators think through what's involved in running a service and how to make it more efficient. However, we do not run the service ourselves. We may well have people in the community over time who are running that software. So that would be the goal, that actually our community is built by those who do run the software. However, the Mojaloop Foundation itself does not run the software. And one of the things that is coming out of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat is to really look at what makes it different when you have open loop versus purely interoperable. And it's that moment of actually how simple it is for another participant to join a scheme, and how much it takes in terms of cost and effort and energy to join an existing scheme. Any thoughts about that from your perspective?
Two for me. One, to Miller's point, is bilaterals are automatically going to be much harder for new people to join a scheme. And so, like, off the bat, that's the biggest reduction in cost for a scheme owner, is move away from bilaterals and then move to a hub in terms of being open. And then the second is making it as easy as possible. And I think we've got about 5 conversations around onboarding for the rest of the week. So everybody pay attention to that. That is a massive cost. If you want to get network effects, you got to get as many DFSPs as possible, and you got to make it easy as possible for them to onboard. So those are my 2 points on that.
And it's also about right of access, equality of access, so that anyone can join. And it's not just in a problem in the markets that we're trying to address, but for example, it's been a problem for a long time in London with the switches, the national switches in the UK, where the big banks that essentially control the switch were denying access to all the smaller players, and in particular fintechs. And it's taken significant regulatory changes to get them to not just open it up to others, including by proxy, where fintechs are too small to actually connect directly, but also to actually admit how much they charge. Because for a very long time, it was secret how much you had to pay to join the switch. And that's a really important point when you're talking about competitive access and right of access. And the Mojaloop option, where you're dealing with the hub operator rather than trying to deal with all the incumbents, does away with all of that. I mean, there are further issues down the line where you probably do have to deal with the larger banks as an MFI, but not in terms of initial access. And if we can address that right from the start, then that's a huge step forward.
Fantastic. So there are obviously other options out there. What's different about choosing Mojaloop for hub operators, that the hub operators and consortiums of DFSPs that want to run a service like this to solve the problem of interconnect efficiently and open loop? What's the difference choosing Mojaloop that consortiums may value, in your perspective?
I want to point out something Adrian asked in the question was, how are we defining hub operator? And I think that kind of guides my answer here. Is very often in a lot of cases, we don't know who the hub operator is. And we've run into this a number of times where the hub operator still needs to be set up. A group of DFSPs have gotten together and said, we have this problem and we need to set it up. A central bank has come saying, hey, I want to solve this problem. I don't know who's going to operate it. And that's just is the reality of the market in a lot of places. And so in that case, I mean, I think that's what's different about Mojaloop, is it allows you, because the ownership structure is so different, it allows you to decide, oh, that ownership and structure, or that operating structure that I decided on the beginning is not actually what I want. And so I want to change my operating model and my ownership model. And you can do that with Mojaloop as long as you set it up at the beginning the right way. But that is an option. And I think we're running into a lot of people who currently they want to move forward, but they don't know what their first step is. And very often the first step of setting up an entity with the perfect governance in place is a long first step.
Yeah,
I think
a huge first step, particularly in many cases when they don't have experience of doing that. And that's another area where the community can assist by saying that essentially this is what a scheme, an operator should look like from a regulatory perspective, with the support of the regulators. And actually, I'd like to come back to this point about how regulators view Mojaloop, if we can briefly.
I think absolutely. So I'm actually going to change the order of my questions, because you may be right that we need to talk first of all, who is the right adopter of Mojaloop, and what is the minimum that it takes for Mojaloop to be the right solution to get started with Mojaloop? And in that question, where do regulators fit?
Well, none of this is going to happen without a regulator giving approval of some sort. I mean, connection into financial sector players and moving money around is essentially a regulated activity. So we need to make sure that we're pleasing regulators. And we can do that through transparency of what we're trying to do. Remember, the priorities of financial regulators they have many, but there's the stability of the financial sector, stability of the economy. They also have a financial inclusion brief, and they're really interested in making sure that there is no crime going on. So we can support all of these in one way or another.
So we the Mojaloop assets do support this, but the right adopters, who should be considering this as software? So for example, we have examples already in our community. So one of our first adopters was Mojaloop. Mojaloop are a private sector initiative to try to get two different mobile money operators to interact with each other cross-border. Then we have UNCDF, which is also a private sector initiative, which is focused on helping MFIs connect to mobile money operators in order to move money for loan repayments, especially in the COVID response time. That's fundamentally important to get distance dealt with in an efficient kind of way. Our third example was Tanzania and TIPS, where at the central bank level, they decided we need open loop, we need it done in a different way to how the private schemes are maybe doing it today. Mm-hmm. Any of those are valid adopters of Mojaloop. How would you characterize a good adopter of Mojaloop?
Steve, do you want to go for that one?
I mean, for me, the most important thing is somebody who believes in the vision of what being part of an open source community and being part of this open source community entails, and what is the value that it brings to their future business needs to be a part of an open source community as opposed to outsourcing to a technology vendor. And so to me, I think we should be looking primarily for hub operators or consortium who want to set up a future hub operator, or regulators who really see that vision. The one that we've missed so I love all three of those, and I think we've been talking about those three. So it's since before we had the three. So it's kind of cool that we have those three examples. But the one that we haven't come up with is the one that is already operating a hub and thinks, oh, hey, this might be a better way for me to do my business. The difference of all three of those is all three of them are setting up a hub operator. And I think it would be interesting for us to see if we could find somebody who is actually already operating an interoperability or multi-DFSP switching and clearing and settlement operation, and understand if we're actually meeting their needs.
And actually, if there's something in our value proposition that is special and different to the average proposition, because I think when you go, it's back to that question of why would you choose Mojaloop rather than a traditional approach, an RFP-driven traditional approach? Obviously, an RFP approach is appropriate for Mojaloop too. However, there are alternate approaches that are possible because our operating model is a little bit different to just buying some software. Is it worth talking about that a little bit?
Or building your own software too. I mean, I think most of the hub operators or integrators or aggregators that we've spoken to, you and I, over the past 6 months, almost all of them that we've spoken to built their own software. And so a lot of it's
so there's a moment of go fast, go alone, go far, go together. was a saying I came across this quarter. It's an African proverb, and it made me think about Mojaloop through different eyes. Actually, part of our value is the fact that the community is continuing to innovate, and a big part of that actually for me is what happened over the course of 2020 with the PISP model. It's the fact that innovations like PISP and open banking now is, you look at the research from CGAP, they talk about PISP as being an essential enabler of the fintech ecosystem and financial inclusion.
I would agree that it is, yes.
Yeah, and as part of our model, we are
really interesting
actively
about
innovating.
this. But what's really interesting about this in the Mojaloop context is we initially looked at the PISP model as it was originally sourced in Singapore, Europe, etc., and that's a particular world view. Whereas within the Mojaloop community, we've taken that and we've made it specific and relevant to developing economies. So suddenly, fintechs can use the PISP model in an economy where you have banks which are not necessarily capable of directly supporting it, for example. So suddenly, this enables financial innovation that was previously impossible in a way that is integrated with the broader financial sector, as opposed to, again, in some little fintech island somewhere. So it's part of the whole. And I think that's been a really interesting dynamic over the last 6 months even. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So I guess I'm curious what your takeaway is from this conversation. From the GTM perspective, what are the messages that we need to give to folk in the community looking closely at Mojaloop and wondering if it's something they should think more about?
I think possibly before, what we should be saying to begin with is you don't have to start off as trying to provide a national service from day one. I think the perspective we've developed in recent months is let's focus on a particular subset, perhaps the MFIs, connecting into perhaps development banks, and we can support that. So we can start in a way which is minimal risk and allows you to grow over a period of weeks and months out towards something which actually has national reach. But don't think national reach day one. We are not trying to immediately step in and be IPSL or whoever. We can start small and grow whilst we build confidence and show that it's working as it should, and reliably, efficiently, and cheaply.
I think, Steve, you also make a really good point about agile methodology in this play.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it is that, and Paul and I talk about this all the time, but like I always say, let's focus on one use case. And he always says, no, it's about the whole ecosystem. And he's more right. But my point is, yes, like being able to start with one thing and then build the next thing, and then build the next thing, and then build the next thing. Yeah. And then eventually you get to an ecosystem. Whereas anytime I've ever seen somebody attempt to build an ecosystem on day one, it never works. You have to start with the first part of it. But you always have a vision for the future ecosystem. And this was our big lesson with the Myanmar MFI project was we probably didn't do a great job of selling that future vision. We focused only on the first use case. And I don't think a lot of people got why we were investing in this totally robust, crazy technology of Mojaloop just to solve this one stupid use case. And it was because there was always this idea that then the industry would be able to add more use cases on top of it until they were part of a larger ecosystem. So I like that agile. Like, let's get this one use case right. Let's learn something from it. Then let's build another use case. Let's learn something from it. Let's build another use case. Let's learn something from it. And each use case is a collaboration between the participants who are the clients of the hub operator and their team, and the regulator, and all of them collaborating on, cool, we did that one use case. Let's all tackle this next one. All right, we tackled that one. Let's do this next one.
Except the counter argument to that is something I put to you, Steve, earlier on today, I think it was. The very earliest days of M-Pesa, it was all about loan disbursements, loan repayments. I managed to persuade the boss, let me implement P2P as well. and he agreed to it. And guess which was the use case which actually took off? It wasn't.
However, Paul,
and I would say
that was an agile approach. That was an agile approach. We started with a closed user group pilot of 300 users. We learned from a small group of 300 what customers actually valued and what was hard and what was tricky and what was difficult. And we pivoted to a simpler business model to launch. And people don't even realize that story. We spent 2 years looking deeply at microfinance before we then simplified the model for the Kenyan story. And I think that's the lesson learned here, is that if you get something to market and you figure out with small closed user groups what's working, what's not working, you've got an agile, lean methodology of taking instant payments to market.
Quite agree.
And that's our vision for our adopter community, that we want to walk with them on that journey.
Yeah.
So a key takeaway for our community as a whole listening to this, what do you think we need to do as the developer community in behind Mojaloop during this quarter? Steve and Paul.
Steve knows my view on this. I think that we should have a Mojaloop hub up and running permanently, proving it's reliable. You can go to it any time of the day or night and run transactions through it.
So I left that in there as a thought that actually that's a big part of the product strategy we've been talking about at Product Council. We've been talking about what Paula introduced earlier was a big part of our conversation this quarter at Product Council around how do we simplify? How do we make it easier to understand what Mojaloop is, and how do we reduce the barriers to adoption and showcase what exactly is going on in that software a little bit more robustly? So that is
proving the point that it's robust and reliable by just leaving it running. There is a hub.
Absolutely.
There it is. Go and play with it. It's
fantastic. So
with
that's
some
a nice
assistance, clearly, but
that's a nice setup for a session later on in the week that I'm running again on Product Council. I'm talking about what we've been talking about for the last 3 months and what we think the next year is going ahead. Steve, do you have any other thoughts to leave for the community?
I mean, I think really supporting the people who are implementing right now. I mean, no one cares about the technology that was behind the technologically successful business failure. And so unless all of these implementations can be working perfectly from a technical perspective, but unless we get a business win, I don't think the community is really going to take off. And so I'd love to see really a lot of effort going towards making sure that what we're introducing into the market is successful, with the power of the community behind regulatory assistance around scheme rules, around end products, around edge cases for the first couple of implementations.
Fantastic. So I can see some questions, and I would say apologies that we haven't been actively dealing with lots of the questions. I think there's been good conversation happening. I can see little things about taxonomy, for example, and the use of the word wallet versus bank account and this, that, and the other. I would actually advertise to you at this point that we intend to have these kind of conversations at Product Council about taxonomy and how we talk about things a lot more. And it's an open forum. So if anyone in the community wants to get involved in helping us with the language and the way that we talk about Mojaloop, please get in touch with me and we'll make you part of the community. Because I think it's important that we start to walk with adopters more during 2021 and we get our language correct. Wallet is coming up as a conversation in particular, and I totally agree with what I'm hearing there.
Couldn't agree more. Yes.
Words like wallet and sandbox and all kinds of things are things that we want to kind of define for our community a little bit more in terms of how we think. So it's an advert for more sessions during the week. Hopefully this is a good taster for how we're starting to think about 2021 and the way that we think about the value proposition of Mojaloop and how we bring that to the market. And from there, I want to hand it back to Simeon for the next session.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you so much, Leslie-Ann, Paula, and Leslie-Ann. Paul, sorry, there's Leslie-Ann, there's Paul, and there's Steve. I appreciate that. And that was very insightful. I see lots of exciting and interesting conversations and questions in the chat. So I do want to point the community towards two things. There is a poll on your screen. Please fill that in. Let us know how your feedback on the session. And then secondly, I would want to point you to the community forum where the discussion is taking place. I'll post a link in the chat there for you. If you've got any questions or any ideas, or we just want to further engage in that conversation, please hop on there. I'm pretty sure Paul and Steve and Leslie-Ann would be happy to answer your questions.
We haven't been answering them during this session because I wasn't watching the channel. Apologies. We'll follow up, and we'll actually take those actively into the taxonomy work that the Product Council are working on.